it's the morning after the elections to fill the chairmanship and councillorship positions in Abuja, Nigeria's Federal Capital Territory. In the build-up to the polls, Minister in charge of the territory, Nyesom Wike, played a huge role making pronouncements, some of which did not go down well with the opposition. But on election day, he was, as expected, up early, touring several polling units across Abuja to monitor the conduct of the polls, beginning from Lagos Crescent in Garki 2, extending to Karu, Karshi and Keti, among other communities. Arise News correspondent Abidemi Sikiru, who was on the entourage of the minister, has this story.
At the various locations visited, voters were seen peacefully exercising their franchise amid tight security presence and orderly accreditation processes. The minister interacted with the electoral officials and residents, assessing compliance with guidelines and the overall conduct of the exercise. Speaking with journalists after the monitoring, Wike described the election as free, fair, and credible, expressing satisfaction with the turnout of voters and the level of organization.
Very low turnout. And in an off-cycle election like this, it's always the case. So what's important is that the election is peaceful, no violence, no slaughter of ballot papers and ballot boxes.
He commended the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, and security agencies for what he termed a smooth and transparent process, noting that early deployment of materials and personnel contributed significantly to the success recorded in the most polling units.
The election is peaceful. It means that security is well done. They've done their job very well. We used to have violence in this polling unit, violence, but in this case, we have not had any case of reported violence in the units.
According to him, the peaceful atmosphere across the council reflects the determination of residents to strengthen grassroots democracy in the Federal Capital Territory. The FCT Area Council election, which determines leadership at the grassroots level in Abuja's 6 councils, are considered crucial to local governance and service delivery. In the days leading to the polls, the FCT administration had declared a work-free day and heightened security measures to guarantee a credible exercise, underscoring the importance attached to peaceful and transparent elections in nation's capital. Abidemi Sikiru, Arise News.
Well, the long-awaited elections for some have come and gone. I know some people are happy. My friend couldn't go to the hospital yesterday because of the no movement in Abuja. And, you know, it's one of those things that you also have a complete economic shutdown for one day for councillorship and chairmanship elections in an area that's not necessarily known as violent. Of course, in a polling unit in Abaji, there was tear gas deployed, but most of the elections seemed to be calm. What really stood out for me is that INEC seemed very unprepared for an election that's actually in the FCT. You had polling units be reassigned with people without some people being informed. INEC did say that they had sent out texts. Not everyone received these text messages. The lack of movement prevented people from going from their location to the actual polling units, especially those whose their polling units had been reassigned. It does not seem that there was a lot of confidence in the electoral process. Of course, it's an off-cycle election, like the Minister Nyesom Wike said. But, you know, with all the noise around this election and with all the big wigs that entered, we saw Atiku Abubakar, former vice president, out there campaigning. Ireti Kingibe, the current senator for the FCT, Peter Obi, Nyesom Wike himself. With all that hoorah and uproar around the election, you'd have expected more turnouts. I saw a polling unit for one of the candidates, and I think the total accredited votes, there were 9 votes. You know, so that type of that lack of confidence in our democratic system or in our, our electoral process, I think is possibly a sign of what we might see later on. Our voter turnout is usually low, especially during off-cycle. But I do think a lot of people feel apathetic, particularly with the recent news and the recent Electoral Act. It does not seem like a lot of people have trust or faith in the system or even wish to participate.
Well, I mean, we'll wait to see the statistics in terms of, the actual turnout and weighed against the number of registered voters and those who actually collected their PVCs. It is true that there is usually voter apathy, usually hovering between 26% to about 34, 35, even in general elections. So maybe this is not just about voter apathy. Maybe the idea and the way that we go about celebrating the number of voters that we have been very huge, the biggest in Africa. Maybe it's also exaggerated. I get the point of the population that is quite, we're the most populated in Africa. But then when we say that in terms of registration, is there something that we political parties do that drive actual potential voters to register, or is there some hanky-panky going on? Because if 100 people registered to vote at a particular unit, and then 96 or 94 are collected their voters card, and on election day only about 26 came out, the difference is staggering. And for me, I struggle to think that it is just about voter apathy. Because if it's voter apathy, why did they choose to register in the first instance? Why did they choose to collect, their voters card? So maybe there's a way that we need to further drill down and actually find out what is happening and what might be discouraging people, if the numbers are real, from coming out. The other point is that we haven't heard much from Kano and Rivers State. And those are also two important states when it comes to the fate of this country. Concentration has been on Abuja, FCT, and from what we have seen so far, the number of people that came out is quite low. But then the interesting thing is the role that the Minister of FCT, Nyesom Wike, played, going around and almost like a supervisor and checking compliance, checking voter turnout, checking everything. I'm not so sure if the Honorable Minister had such powers, or maybe he's just taking liberty, to check what is going on. In what capacity? Is it as the Minister of the Federal Capital Territory, or as a supervisor to INEC? Because he isn't, very clearly. So when he announces that the president, wanted a restriction of movement, that obviously doesn't concern him, because during general elections, presidents and even governors in their territories only go to their own their polling units. Is the minister telling us that as the number one in Abuja after the president, he didn't vote yesterday? If he voted, why will he therefore leave his own polling unit and then be checking? Of course, the argument will be that he doesn't vote in Abuja because it's a Rivers man. So he has all the time. But then what if he had seen anything that didn't work? What could he have done? I called Professor Amupito to say that I discovered something in a particular zone, or what? I don't think that was the sort of a role that the minister is expected to play. If he had briefed, like he did on the eve of the election, if he had, called a press conference, as he will always do, to say that this is what I have observed, this is, my understanding of what is going on, and I've spoken to people who are in charge of the elections, so I'm airing my opinion. But then to be going from point A to B with an entourage, I'm not so sure that will have given confidence to the people. If you declared a work-free day, on the eve, and then on the election day, you say people shouldn't go out, whereas there has been delineation for many people who wouldn't, therefore who couldn't know that they have been transferred from one polling unit to the other. It's not the best way. It didn't quite convey, a reassurance of an unfair umpire in quote. But of course, we will have David Emefiele, later on. His organization released a statement, analyzing what they observed regarding the elections in Abuja yesterday. We can't call the elections yet because we will need to wait for INEC. But of course, different things have been flying around on social media, given the importance that the FCT holds in elections like this, really. So it will be interesting to find out at the end of the day what actually happened. There were about, how many parties were involved, who carried the day in all the 6 jurisdictions where the elections, held yesterday. It will be interesting to know what happened, by what margin, because that might be an indication to what to expect early next year for Abuja. And then on a general note, it will be an indication, particularly for ADC, which is new, among all the parties. And then, testing the powers of the ruling party, which has always struggled in Abuja. But of course, we will see how they performed yesterday, But at least in terms of buying, votes, in terms of outright violence, I think those were quite low and commendable, yesterday. But then if majority of the people stayed back at home, maybe that explains why, things were a bit quiet, and seemingly orderly, Those will be my. But we will see how this way, won't we? Yes. What happens. All right, then. Away from the local scene, U.S. President Donald Trump has responded with fury to Friday's Supreme Court ruling that he lacked the power to unilaterally set tariffs on imports, denouncing individual justices as he vowed to continue a global trade war that has kept the world on edge for a year. Trump announced an immediate new 10% tariff on imports from all countries on top of any existing tariffs, and then issued a proclamation putting them into effect.
Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs. The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
All right, that was President Trump there. We mentioned it in passing yesterday, if you recall, Adisua, because it was on the cover of This Day where we reviewed the newspaper. Of course, there has been an update. He has now, increased the global tariffs to 15%. He put that out on Truth Social, his social media platform, to say that he is, going a bit further, after the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 to declare what he has done for almost a year, almost a whole year now, as illegal, invoking emergency powers, on trades and tariffs. The judgment was quite clear. The president lacked, such powers, not powers to invoke emergency power, but to import such powers into matters of trade, and tariff. Of course, as expected, Trump didn't like it. And then what he has done now is to look for, with his team, to look for areas and legal, leeways to do that which he has always wanted. And if you want to be fair to him, whether rightly or wrongly, he has always been shouting about the fact that America is being ripped off, even when he was never president, that other countries should play their part so that America does not continue to be the Father Christmas, of the world. What does it mean to now impose 15% tariffs? It simply means that there are other instruments, legally speaking, that the president can call up, to fight his war, basically reciprocal or otherwise. But of course, the handicap there is that it is not. You can't use it arbitrarily, and it is also temporary. You can, I believe it's about 5 months before you would need to seek Congress approval as to the 15%. 15% is the maximum under the Trade Act of the United States that you can apply tariffs. All countries do apply tariffs to protect, if they deem it necessary, to protect industries, to protect their countries. Some other people might even argue that maybe Trump, because of the sort of love that he claims that he has for his country, might be doing the right thing, but in the wrong way. But of course, we will see. And what is clear about this is that democracy is beautiful. No president should run riot. The court should be able to call you to order and then tell you, when you have overstepped your bound. This is what has happened in America. And of course, Trump is learning.
Trump is learning. I mean, it's very interesting. Justice Gersh said that the legislative process is a bulwark of liberty. And I think that, and, he was saying that the pendulum might swing. Those who are for this now might be against this later. Those who are, against this now might be for other processes. But essentially, the legislative process, the Supreme Court, these institutions are supposed to protect the citizens from arbitrary use of power, arbitrary use of executive orders. And I particularly think about it when I think about Nigeria right now with Executive Order 9 and President Tinubu, when it comes to the PIA, going against sections of the PIA, because again, our legislative process and our judiciary are incredibly important, and presidential power should be limited to what our constitution says it is. But in terms of Donald Trump,
that should be tested in law,
and it should be tested in law. It should always be tested in law.
Absolutely.
I do think I no longer practice, but as a lawyer, I sometimes worry when lawyers only present commentary or politicians only present commentary when they should test it in our courts. That it's incredibly important for us to know what the limits are. Can you do it retroactively? Can you go against an act of the National Assembly? So far, our laws tell us no. And so why are we just discussing this instead of testing this in the courts? And when it comes to Donald Trump, for example, the actualized GDP of America is now 1.4%. That's the slowest growth rate they've had in over a decade. The jobs report for last year was also incredibly lower than expected. For me, because of both of my countries, when I look at America, I look at how well, when we say the economy is doing well, they usually look at Wall Street and how well Wall Street is looking. And I also look at Nigeria and I look at the macroeconomic indicators. And when we say President Tinubu's policies are working, it's usually macroeconomic we're talking about, right? And do those effects trickle down? They're the same as America. Do the effects of Wall Street, does it trickle down? Do the effects of these, subsidy is gone and we have positive macro trends, do they trickle down to the average American or do they trickle down to the average Nigerian? There's ways we measure success, the ways these economic indices, I think they're very important. But also for me, what is most important about this story is that institutions matter. And that's what America's Supreme Court has shown us. And Nigerians should test their own institutions at all times, engage the process. At least if they then fail, we'll say that they failed us.
There are some whom I think that the Nigerian president is probably more powerful, exercises more power than even the American president. But again, like you said, test the powers. That's the beauty of law and democracy.
Test it. After if you fail, then we can say, well, at least you tried.